There are things I have never explained to any client, any colleague, or any inspector of the Metropolitan Police. I have always considered this a professional virtue. It did not occur to me until the afternoon I walked into Harrington's portrait studio on Regent Street that the past I keep private might one day walk out to meet someone else first.
When the evidence envelope came across my desk, I understood two things immediately. The first was that its contents were unrelated to the active investigation. The second was that I would not be examining them further. What I chose to do instead is the case I am not permitted to put in any official report.
Maud West, private inquirer, licensed, discreet, and, as of a grey Thursday morning in November, in possession of a cover identity she did not expect, a darkroom she did not anticipate, and a sleeve of photographs she had hoped no one would ever find. Someone found them. The Darkroom Dilemma.
It had been 11 days since the Savoy. In those 11 days I had accepted 2 matrimonial inquiries, declined 1 request to retrieve a small terrier from a former husband who had taken it in bad faith, written 2 reports, and drunk rather more tea than is strictly necessary for a woman in good health. Flynn had sent a note on the 4th day. 1 line, on yard stationery, regarding a detail in the Kessler file that required my signature. I had signed it and returned it the same afternoon. Professional, orderly, entirely correct. The work, as it always does, provided its own remedy. The new case arrived on a Thursday in the form of a Mr. Aldis Craven, 60, prosperous, deeply unhappy. He was not, it emerged, the person I was really being engaged to help. Craven was an intermediary. 3 men of his acquaintance had received demands for money accompanied by photographs. Private moments, nothing criminal, everything ruinous. The photographs had been taken inside Harrington's portrait studio on Regent Street. The victims had all sat for portraits there in the last 2 years. The demands had been arriving for 6 weeks. Craven wanted it stopped. He left a retainer, collected his hat and departed. Then the second visitor arrived. Lady Cavendish came to my office an hour after Craven left. She was a woman of 50, composed in the way that people are composed when composure is costing them a great deal. And she had in her hand a photograph in a plain envelope. She placed it on the desk between us and did not look at it. The photograph showed her leaving a house in Bloomsbury at an hour that required no further explanation. She had been visiting a friend. She was precise about this, and I believed her. And it did not matter in the slightest because the photograph did not deal in explanations. It dealt only in appearance, and appearance was sufficient. She had already received the demand. She had not paid it. She had come to me instead. I told her I was already on the case. I told her I would retrieve her files before they became anyone else's property. She looked at me for a long moment with the particular assessment of a woman who has learned not to trust reassurances, and then she nodded once and left. I made a note. I made tea. I considered the shape of the thing. A portrait studio is not merely a place where photographs are taken. It is a place where people relax their guard. They sit still for 20 minutes under bright lights, told to look natural, persuaded into candour by the professional cheerfulness of the photographer's assistant. They talk. They forget where they are. And all around them, in the studio, in the reception room, in the back rooms where the plates are prepared, people are listening. I needed to be inside that studio, not as a client, as the darkroom girl.
2 commissions, 1 studio. Agnes Bright, assistant to Mr. Harrington of Regent Street, arrives for her first morning's work and discovers that a portrait studio in November is a very different place from what it appears in the light. We return for Act 2.
Harrington's occupied the ground floor of a Georgian terrace between a milliner and a tobacconist. The front room was reception and display, portraits arranged on dark velvet stands, a chaise longue of faded brocade for waiting clients, a desk where the appointments book lived. The studio itself was behind a curtained archway, high-ceilinged, north-facing, the kind of room that makes ordinary people look interesting and interesting people look eternal. The dark room was further back still, down a narrow corridor that smelled of stop bath and old wood. Mr. Harrington had interviewed 3 applicants for the assistant's position. The previous girl had left without notice a fortnight ago, and he was considerably behind with his developing. He had not asked Agnes Bright many penetrating questions. He had asked whether she could follow instructions and whether she was reliable. I had said yes to both with complete sincerity. I could follow instructions. I was entirely reliable. I was also, as of 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the most attentive person in the building. On my first afternoon, I unlocked the narrow rear service exit at the end of the back corridor and memorized the alley beyond it. In my line of work, you do not step into a room without mapping the fastest way out of it. The first morning was orientation, the order of the chemical trays, the timing of the developer, the temperature of the fix bath, the correct angle at which to hold a negative to the safe light. Mr. Harrington was thorough, if not warm. His instructions were precise. He did not explain more than he had to. I listened to everything he said. I listened, also, to everything he did not say. There were 2 filing cabinets in the back room. One was clearly labelled Client Surnames, alphabetical, the ordinary filing of an ordinary business. The other was not labelled at all. It was older than the first, heavier, and its lock had been changed recently. I could tell by the colour of the scratches around the keyhole, bright metal where the old paint had been disturbed, the kind of scratches left by a locksmith in a hurry. I noted it. I did not touch it, not yet. By the 3rd day, I understood the studio's real economy. The portrait commissions were genuine. Harrington was a competent photographer and his prices were reasonable. But threaded through the legitimate business was something else, a set of appointments that did not appear in the main book, clients who arrived at irregular hours, envelopes that left the building in a direction that had nothing to do with the post. The receptionist, a Mrs. Dowell, handled the irregular appointments. She was careful and quick, and she never left paperwork unattended. The waiter at the cafe 2 doors down, who came each morning with a delivery that was never quite the right order, was carrying messages out. The milliner next door, whose girl came in on Tuesdays for what was described as a portrait consultation that never resulted in any photographs, was carrying messages in. On the 4th evening, I was in the back room when I overheard Harrington in the corridor, speaking to Mrs. Dowell in the low, particular tone of a man giving instructions he considers important. He was expecting a private appointment at midnight. A gentleman, he said, who was coming in through the rear courtyard to purchase a piece of art. A member of the cabinet, he said, and he said it the way men say things when they know the weight of the words and enjoy feeling it. I stayed very still over my developing trays and listened to every word. Midnight, a cabinet minister. Harrington was not merely running a local blackmail operation out of a Regent Street studio. He was selling access to the highest levels of government. The network was considerably larger than 3 victims and a portrait photographer, and the Unlabeled Cabinet was the centre of all of it. I needed it, and I needed it before midnight. Mr. Harrington left at 5:30 on the 4th day to dine before his midnight appointment. Mrs. Dowell departed at 5 on the dot, as she always did. The studio was mine. The Unlabeled Cabinet took 4 minutes. The lock was a Chubb lever, and the key Harrington kept on a ring in his desk drawer with 11 others. He had evidently not thought it necessary to separate it from the rest, which told me something about the limits of his caution. I worked through them methodically in the low light. The cabinet contained 12 box files. Each was labelled by year and, within the year, by a letter number code. The contents were negatives, mounted in paper sleeves, each sleeve annotated in a small and careful hand. The annotations were not names, they were codes, but codes of a simple kind, the kind used by a man who needed to retrieve things quickly and had not expected to need to hide them from anyone who could think. I found Lady Cavendish's sleeve on the second pass through the current year's file. I held it to the safe light long enough to confirm the contents, replaced it in its sequence, and continued working through the rest. I was on the 31st sleeve when I stopped. The image was small, a 2-inch glass plate, the kind used in a concealed camera. The subject was a woman in a music hall dressing room. She was not aware she was being photographed. She was in the process of removing stage makeup at a dressing table mirror, and the camera had caught her in 3/4 profile, her face half in the light, half in shadow. She was wearing the costume of a stage performer, something gaudy and theatrical that bore no resemblance to anything in her actual wardrobe. It was me. I put the negative down. I picked it up again. I held it to the light a second time, because I am not a woman who accepts evidence without examination, even evidence of her own face. It was unambiguously me. 3 years ago, perhaps 4, the OldGate Palace case. I had spent 6 weeks in the chorus of a second-rate music hall on a commission that required access to the backstage organisation. I had not been Agnes Bright on that occasion. I had been Dolly Marsh, and Dolly Marsh had worn sequins and too much coal, and I had rather enjoyed myself, which was an aspect of the case I had not included in my report. I checked the rest of the sleeve. 4 images in total. All from the same evening. All taken with a concealed camera through the dressing room mirror. None of them criminal. All of them mine. I understood the situation immediately and did not care for it. Harrington's network had informants inside every fashionable establishment in London. One of them, years ago, had been inside the OldGate Palace on a night I was working it. They had photographed me without knowing who I was. Photographed me the way they photographed everyone, as insurance, as future leverage. It was possible they still did not know who I was. Agnes Bright was a good cover. My hair was different. The dressing room images were 3 years old and poorly lit. It was also possible they knew exactly who I was, and I was the one being watched. I was still considering this when I heard the rear service door open. I slid the sleeve back into its correct position in the cabinet, closed the drawer, and turned to face the door with the expression of a darkroom assistant who has been working late and is mildly surprised by a visitor. Flynn stood in the doorway. He was in plain clothes, a dark overcoat, no hat. He had come through the rear alley, which meant he had been watching the building, which meant he knew considerably more about what was happening on Regent Street than Constable Briggs's memo had suggested. He looked at me. He looked at the cabinet. He looked at me again. His expression made exactly one adjustment, and then returned to neutral. "The studio is closed for the evening, sir. Sittings are by appointment only." A pause. Flynn stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. The red light sealed us both in its particular amber dark.
"I'm not here for a sitting, Agnes."
He said the cover name precisely, which was the driest possible acknowledgement that he recognised the situation and was not going to make it easy. I dropped the meek posture. There was no point maintaining it with Flynn, and we both knew it, and the pretence of maintaining it would have cost time we did not have. "Inspector, you're in the middle of a live operation."
So are you, Maud, which is the problem. Special Branch has a warrant executing at midnight. Full raid. Every room, every file, every person on the premises. I have a surveillance team on every door. If my men find you here when the hammer comes down, I cannot protect you from the fallout.
He was watching me with the particular concentration he uses when he is trying to determine how much of the situation I already know. It is a look I have been on the receiving end of before. It is not a comfortable look. Your timing is inconvenient. I have a client whose files will end up in a public evidence record if your men bludgeon their way through here without guidance. Scotland Yard wants a high-profile prosecution. My client wants her life back. Those are not the same thing.
The law does not make exceptions for private timelines.
The law also does not have access to the contents of that cabinet, which I do. Harrington is not the principal. He's a node. The operation runs through a central office in Clerkenwell. A man named Fitch. If your men arrest Harrington and seize the surface files without the network map, Fitch walks. A silence. Flynn looked at the cabinet, then at me. The red light made it difficult to read his expression with any precision, which I suspected was mutual.
How long do you need?
I have what I need from the cabinet. I need 1 hour to compile the network map and get it to Briggs before the raid. If he has the Clerkenwell address, the warrant covers Fitch as well as Harrington.
1 hour. Midnight comes regardless. If you are still in this building when the glass breaks, I will have no choice but to treat you as part of the syndicate. For your own sake, Maud, get what you need and get out.
He held my gaze for a moment. There was something in it. Not concern, precisely, because Flynn does not permit himself concern in operational settings. But the thing that concern becomes when it is being held at arm's length by professional necessity. Then he turned, opened the door, and was gone back into the alley. I stood in the red light for a moment. The clock on the back room wall said 23 minutes past 10. I had work to do.
1 hour, a network map to compile, a covering note to write, and a cabinet of secrets to leave exactly as she found it. At 11:58, the glass plates were still in the cabinet, the sleeve was still in the file, and the raid was 2 minutes early. Act 3.
I compiled the network map in 40 minutes. 12 pages. The cabinet's coded system decoded. The Clerkenwell address identified from a cross-reference in the current year's files. The 7 studio nodes mapped. The informant placements listed. Mrs. Dowell's role in the irregular appointments documented. It was thorough because it needed to be thorough. I had no way of knowing which details Briggs already had, and I was not prepared to let Fitch escape on account of something I had left out. I sent 6 pages to Constable Briggs at the yard by the 9 o'clock post, which on a Friday evening in Regent Street means the last collection box 2 streets north. I kept 6 pages, the pages concerning methods and informant placements that would be more useful in my own files than in a public evidence record. That left me 20 minutes before midnight. I went back to the cabinet. This was not strictly necessary. I had the network map. I had what I came for. Lady Cavendish's sleeve was in the file, and Briggs's men would find it when they came in, and I had identified it in the covering note as a non-evidential item for return. But my own sleeve was also in the file, and I had not identified it in the covering note, because there are things one does not put in covering notes to Scotland Yard. I went back for it. I found the sleeve. I held it to the safe light one final time. 4 plates, 2 inches each, glass. They would not fold. They would not compress. I had a wool coat with deep interior pockets, and the plates were exactly thick enough to make the pockets sit wrong. A noticeable bulge on a woman being escorted by constables. I was working them into the lining when the sound began. 11:58. They were 2 minutes early. The door of the back room shook in its frame as something heavy struck the corridor wall. I heard a constable's voice close. Securing the corridor, check the back rooms. I looked at the glass plates in my hands. I looked at the rear service door at the end of the corridor. The door I had unlocked on the first afternoon. The door I had memorized against exactly this contingency. I had perhaps 8 seconds. I put the plates back in the sleeve. I put the sleeve back in the file. I put the file back in the cabinet and pushed the drawer shut and left the key on the ring on the desk where I had found it. Then I dropped my darkroom apron on the floor, crossed the corridor in 4 steps, and stepped out into the alley. The door closed behind me. Inside, I heard the back room door come open. The alley was cold and dark and smelled of rain and old brick. I walked to the end of it, turned north, and was on Regent Street in 30 seconds, where I became an unremarkable woman in a dark coat going about unremarkable business on a Friday evening. The raid was entirely successful. Harrington did not run. Mrs. Dowell managed 3 of the irregular appointments cards before Briggs's man secured the drawer. 3 cards were not enough to matter, and she knew it, which told me she had burned the important material beforehand. The network map reached Briggs in time. The Clerkenwell address was raided at midnight. Gerald Fitch was in custody by 1. The sleeve with the 4 glass plates was in the cabinet when Briggs's men went through it. I had left it there on purpose. I told myself this was the tactically correct decision. The plates were glass. They were fragile. I had 8 seconds and no guarantee that a constable would not have patted down my coat in the corridor. All of this was true. I am not entirely sure it was the whole reason.
The alley, the dark, the sleeve left behind in the cabinet. At Scotland Yard, the evidence boxes arrive the following morning. The filing system is methodical. Every sleeve will be examined. All 43 of them. Act 4.
The Harrington case came to me on a Saturday morning in the form of a memo from Constable Briggs and 3 cardboard boxes sealed with evidence tape. The memo was precise. Warrants had been executed at Harrington's portrait studio and at an address in Clerkenwell the previous evening, following information received from an independent inquiry agent working a private commission. The arrests included Harrington, Mrs. Dowell, Gerald Fitch, and 4 members of the wider network. I noted the phrasing. Independent inquiry agent is the official language for what Maud does. She had been inside that studio. She had found the network before I had, or at any rate had found its full shape before the raid. And she had got the Clerkenwell address to Briggs in time to make the difference between 1 arrest and 5. The raid's report noted that a darkroom assistant had been seen leaving through the rear service exit at approximately midnight. They had not pursued her. I had told them not to, in the operational briefing, without specifying why. The boxes contained the contents of both the unlabeled filing cabinet and the surface files from Harrington's back room. The case was, in its criminal dimensions, largely concluded. The evidence needed processing and logging before it went to the Crown. I processed it methodically. The 12 box files, the coded sleeves, the negatives 1 by 1 held to the light, logged, described, referenced against the known victims, set in sequence. I was on the 31st sleeve of the current year's file when I stopped. The image was a 2-inch plate concealed camera taken in a dressing room. A woman at a mirror, stage costume, unaware of the lens. I recognized her immediately. I set the negative down. I did not reach for my pen. I did not open the evidence log. I looked at the negative on the table in front of me, then at the evidence log, then at the negative again. I considered the matter with what I hope was appropriate professional detachment, although I am aware that the length of time I spent considering it was not, by any standard measure, entirely detached. There were 4 images in the sleeve. I examined all 4. They revealed nothing criminal. They revealed nothing dishonorable. They revealed a woman I know professionally, know as a colleague, know as a person of considerable ability and carefully maintained private habits, in a context she would not have chosen to share, doing work I had not known she had done, in a place that bore no resemblance to any account she had given me of her past, which was entirely her prerogative. Maud West owes me no account of her past. We are colleagues, not confidants. The professional relationship has always been clear on this point. I looked at the photograph for a moment longer. There was an expression in the mirror that I had not seen before, not the expression she presents to clients or to the yard or to anyone in the ordinary run of things. Something less managed. It put me in mind of a hotel room at the Savoy, a bolt I did not draw. A morning over eggs when neither of us said what either of us was thinking. She had had the advantage then, if she had chosen to use it. She had not chosen to use it. I remained at the evidence table for some time. Then I picked up my pen and wrote in the evidence log the following. Sleeve 31, current year file, contents examined, 4 glass plate negatives. Images assessed as unrelated to active blackmail investigation, no known victim correspondence, logged as non-evidential. I initialed it. I closed the sleeve. I placed it in a separate evidence envelope, wrote on the outside, non-evidential, for return or destruction per standard procedure, and set it apart from the rest. Then I continued with the evidence log. The remaining negatives took another 2 hours. The Harrington network was large and its files were thorough. When I was finished, I had enough evidence to put 4 men before a magistrate and enough ancillary material to occupy the Crown's Counsel for the better part of a fortnight. I set the non-evidential envelope on the corner of my desk. I was aware it was there for the remainder of the day, in the way one is aware of a window left open in cold weather. Not an emergency, not something requiring immediate attention, but present and requiring eventual resolution. At 5:30, I sent a note to Maud West's office in the manner of routine case correspondence. The note said, regarding Harrington matter, evidence processed. Please attend at your earliest convenience to collect any items pertaining to your own involvement in the investigation. F. It was entirely professional. It said nothing about what I had seen. It said nothing about what I had done with it. I was fairly certain she would understand both.
We'll pause there for a moment. If you are listening to MicroPulse, we'd very much like to know where you are in the world and what the hour is where you're sitting. Drop it in the comments, your location, your hour, whatever corner of things you've made yourself comfortable in, and we hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps MicroPulse continue to grow. Now Rikaksa are back to Whitehall. The studio is closed, the arrests are made, the network is broken. At Scotland Yard, on the corner of an inspector's desk, there is a manila envelope marked non-evidential. Inside it, 4 glass plate negatives of a woman who left them behind on purpose. Or perhaps not. She's about to find out what he did with them either way.
Flynn's note had said, earliest convenience. I arrived the following morning at 10, which was convenient and also somewhat earlier than I would have chosen, had I been making the decision entirely on my own terms. This is the kind of detail I notice and later regret noticing. He was at the evidence table when I came in. The Harrington files were stacked in labelled order along the shelving. The table itself was clear except for a single manila envelope in the top right corner, placed with the precision of a man who sets things where he means to set them. Flynn looked up. He looked, as he generally does in professional contexts, as though he has been expecting whoever comes through the door and has had time to compose himself accordingly.
Miss West, thank you for coming in.
Inspector Flynn, the Harrington files appear to be in order.
They are. Briggs has done thorough work. The Clerkenwell address proved productive. We have Fitch in custody and the network map was substantially correct. Your document was useful.
I'm glad to hear it. He did not move toward the envelope. I did not move toward the envelope. We both knew it was there, and we were both, in our different ways, taking our time about it.
The filing system took a moment to decode. Fitch's design apparently, 4 years of material in those 12 boxes.
Mrs. Dowell was the more interesting operator. She managed to destroy 3 of the irregular cards before Briggs secured the drawer.
3 cards are not enough to matter, as she was evidently aware.
Professional.
in her way.
A pause. Flynn picked up the manila envelope and placed it on the table between us.
The evidence log for the current year's file is complete. All 43 sleeves processed and recorded. 42 of them are entered as evidential material for the Crown.
He looked at the envelope. He looked at me.
Sleeve 31 was assessed as unrelated to the active investigation. I've logged it as non-evidential. Standard procedure from here would be return to subject or destruction.
I see.
The images are not described in the evidence record beyond 4 glass plate negatives, non-evidential.
I see.
She had said it twice. It was not a deficiency of language. It was the only thing there was to say. These appear unrelated to the active case.
He said it as though it were a finding he had reached through the ordinary processes of professional judgment. Of course. Thank you, Flynn.
Standard procedure.
I picked up the envelope. I put it in my bag. I did not open it in the evidence room, because there was nothing to examine. I already knew what was in it, and so did he. And the knowing was the thing that needed no further examination. He had already picked up his pen and returned to the evidence log. We discussed 3 further points of the case: the Clerkenwell connection, the question of outstanding victims, a detail in the appointments book that wanted clarification. We spoke for perhaps 12 minutes. The conversation was entirely professional. Both of us were exactly where we were supposed to be. At 11 o'clock, I thanked him for his time and left the evidence room. In the corridor, I stopped. I stood there for a moment that was perhaps a moment longer than was strictly warranted, with a manila envelope in my bag and a question I had not asked and would not ask, because there are things one does not press even when one is fairly certain of the answer. Then I put on my gloves and went out into Whitehall. I made the tea before I opened the envelope. This was not entirely a function of wanting tea. It was a function of wanting the ordinary procedure of the office around me before I opened a thing I had not expected to be given back. The 4 negatives were in their paper sleeve. I laid them out on the desk. 4 small glass plates, each one 2 inches long, each one a record of an evening I remembered well and had not thought of in some time. I had been 29. The OldGate Palace case had been my second commission of that type. The first had been in a theatre in Soho the previous year, and I had found that I had a particular aptitude for it. The transformation required is not the one most people assume. It is not about the costume or the stage makeup or the ability to carry a tune. It is about the willingness to stop being, for an evening, the version of yourself you have constructed for professional purposes, and become instead something altogether more instinctive. Some people find this difficult. I did not. I had, as I had mentioned to myself and to no one else, rather enjoyed it. The photographs showed a woman in a sequined costume at a dressing table, removing kohl from her eyes with cold cream and a cloth. Her expression in the mirror. My expression, 3 years ago, in the low light of a music hall dressing room, was not the expression I generally present to clients, or to Flynn, or to anyone in the ordinary professional run of my days. It was something less managed, something more itself. I looked at it for a while. Then I picked up all 4 plates and held them over the brass ashtray on the corner of my desk. I picked up the box of matches, then placed them in the right-hand drawer. I stood there for a moment. Then I put the negatives back in the sleeve, put the sleeve in the envelope, and put the envelope in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, under a folder marked Pending, Closed, Not Destroyed, Filed. I am not entirely sure I can explain the distinction to my own satisfaction. There is the official version. The negatives are evidence of a past commission that may, in some theoretical future, require verification. They are therefore a professional record and should be retained. There is the other version, a man looked at 4 photographs of me and chose not to see anything he was not meant to see. Or rather, chose not to say he had seen it. And that distinction between seeing and saying is one I have been turning over in my mind since I walked out of the evidence room and stood in the corridor perhaps a moment longer than was strictly warranted. He also told a raid team not to pursue a woman leaving through a rear service exit at midnight. I did not know this for certain. I inferred it from the raid report, which listed the rear exit incident and noted that no pursuit had been authorized. Flynn authorizes or declines those decisions. It was his operation. I have been given something back. Twice, perhaps, if the inference is correct. I have not decided what to do with that yet. I put out the desk lamp and sat for a while in the light from the window, which in November at noon is already the colour of late afternoon, and did not examine the feeling. There is a category of person who moves through the world operating entirely on the logic of evidence, who makes no claim beyond what can be verified, no inference beyond what the facts directly support, and no concession to the possibility that the facts might be doing something other than presenting themselves. I am generally that person. It is why I am good at what I do. It is also, I am beginning to suspect, a habit that can be applied with rather too much determination to certain questions that are not, at their core, questions of evidence. What I have from Flynn, a Manila envelope, a log entry that says 4 words less than it could have said, an hour he gave me in a red-lit room when he did not have to, and a raid report with a decision in it that I did not ask for and was not told about. What I do not have, any reason whatsoever, evidentiary or otherwise, to suppose that any of these choices mean anything other than what they appear to mean on the surface, which is that he is a thorough officer with a well-developed sense of what is and is not relevant to an active investigation, and a practical understanding of when a private operative's access is more useful than her absence. I am not, at present, finding this argument convincing. He has seen a version of me I did not choose to show him. He has seen it and said nothing, and returned it, and gone back to the evidence log. The professional explanation for this is the correct explanation. There is no requirement to look for another. And yet, I had a case 3 years ago in which a client kept insisting there was no significance to a fact that kept recurring in the evidence. The fact was a name, small, unremarkable, appearing in contexts the client had a reason to find unremarkable. I pressed the point 3 times before he acknowledged it. He was not lying. He had simply made a decision somewhere before the conversation began about what the facts were going to mean, and he was holding to it. I told him at the time that evidence does not concern itself with our prior decisions about its significance. I appear to have needed to tell myself the same thing. The envelope is in the bottom drawer. The negatives are there, not destroyed, filed. The woman in them is 3 years ago, and a different context and a costume I no longer own. But the expression in the mirror is mine. And it is mine now as much as it was hers then, and Flynn has looked at it. And I have not asked him what he saw, and neither of us is going to address this directly, which is the correct professional position, and also, I suspect, not the whole story. There is a category of mystery that is not meant to be solved immediately. Only attended to, carefully, and then, for the moment, set aside. I have become quite accustomed to this category. The kettle had gone cold while I was sitting. I made a fresh pot. I put on the desk lamp. I opened the next file. Until the next inquiry. I remain Maud West, private inquirer.
You've been listening to the case files of Maud West. Tonight's episode, The Darkroom Dilemma. Join us next time when another truth waits to be brought to light by whoever is patient enough and honest enough to go looking for it.